When Adis urinates on an old tree stump during a dare, she unknowingly breaks the seal of Ohonwani, a vengeful spirit buried beneath it. Haunted by terrifying visions and a creeping darkness spreading through her body, she seeks help from the village elders, who reveal the deadly curse she has unleashed. A dangerous ritual of fire is her only hope, but Ohonwani will not let go easily. Though the ritual saves her, Adis is left with a strange mark and a lingering presence. The whispers never fade, and she soon realizes the spirit is still with her, waiting. Adis never believed in superstitions. She thought the elders' warnings about spirits haunting certain places were just ways to scare children into obedience. So when her friends dared her to urinate on the old, dry tree stump in the abandoned part of the village, she laughed and accepted without hesitation. The tree stump had a dark history. The villagers whispered that it was once a mighty tree used for sacrifices. The elders had forbidden anyone from disturbing it, claiming that something terrible lurked within. But Adis, rebellious and fearless, stepped over the twisted roots, unfastened her wrapper, and relieved herself on the stump, laughing at her friends' shocked faces. A chilling breeze passed through the trees. The air thickened, carrying a foul, decayed scent. The laughter of her friends faded as an eerie silence fell over them. Then, from within the depths of the stump, came a low, guttural whisper. A debt must be paid. Adis froze, her heart hammering in her chest. She turned to her friends, expecting them to be playing a prank, but the fear in their eyes was real. The ground beneath the stump trembled slightly. A deep crack formed along its surface, as if something beneath was awakening. Fear gripped Adis. She quickly tied her wrapper and ran, her friends following close behind. None of them spoke as they raced back to the village. But as Adis reached the safety of her home, she realized something was terribly wrong. Her reflection in the mirror, it wasn't hers. It was someone else's. Someone ancient. Someone furious. And she was smiling back at Adis. Adis stumbled backward, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The face staring at her from the mirror was twisted and unfamiliar, sunken eyes, cracked lips, and skin that looked as if it had been burned and healed over multiple times. Yet, the most terrifying thing wasn't the face itself. It was the smile. A slow, knowing grin stretched across the reflection's lips, as if mocking her. Adis shook her head violently and blinked hard. When she opened her eyes, her normal reflection was back, her brown eyes wide with terror, her forehead glistening with sweat. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe the fear from earlier had played tricks on her mind. She tried to convince herself of that as she pulled her wrapper tighter around her body and crawled into bed. But sleep did not come easily. At midnight, a sharp knock echoed through her small room. Knock. Knock. She sat up abruptly, her heart hammering. The knock came again, slow and deliberate. Her parents were asleep in the next room, and no one visited at such an ungodly hour. Then, something was happened. The knock moved. It was no longer on her door. It was on her window. With trembling hands, she turned her head toward the window, praying that it was just the wind. But through the thin white curtains, she saw it, a shadow, unmoving, waiting. Adis covered her mouth to keep from screaming. Then, in a voice that sent ice down her spine, the shadow spoke. You made a mistake, Adis, and now, it is time to pay. Adis' blood turned to ice. The voice was neither male nor female, just a whisper filled with malice, seeping through the cracks in the night like an unseen poison. She couldn't move. Her body refused to obey her mind's desperate commands to flee. The shadow outside her window loomed larger, its outline shifting as though it was breathing. Then, something even worse happened. The window creaked open on its own. Addis let out a strangled cry and scrambled to the other side of her bed, pressing her back against the wall. The air inside her room grew thick with the scent of damp earth and something rotten, the same stench that had come from the tree stump. A cold wind slithered inside, whispering across her skin. The curtains swayed, revealing nothing beyond the window but the endless darkness of the village night. Then, the whisper returned. Addis, did you think you could walk away? Her breath hitched. You defiled the resting place. Now, you belong to me. The voice was inside her room now. With a trembling hand, Addis reached for the lamp beside her bed and turned it on. The light flickered, weak and unstable, casting eerie shadows on the walls. But the moment she looked at the mirror, she wished she hadn't. Her reflection was there again, but it wasn't hers. The woman in the mirror was closer this time, grinning wider, her eyes black as the void. Her lips moved, but instead of sound, something crawled out of the mirror, a mass of dark, riding tendrils slithering toward Addis. The last thing she saw before darkness swallowed her room was a hand reaching out from the glass. Addis woke up to the sound of her mother's voice calling her name. Sunlight streamed into her room, chasing away the darkness of the night before. She gasped, sitting up in bed, her body drenched in sweat. Had it all been a dream? Her eyes darted toward the mirror, her heartbeat pounding in her ears. It looked normal now. No shadowy figure. No reaching hand. Just her own reflection, looking pale and shaken. But as she swung her legs over the side of the bed, something felt off. A dull ache throbbed at the back of her head, and her hands trembled slightly. Ignoring it, she rushed to the kitchen where her mother was preparing breakfast. You slept in late, her mother noted without looking at her. Addis hesitated. I didn't sleep well. Her mother finally turned, frowning. Did something happen? The urge to confess gripped her, but something stopped her. A voice in the back of her head. Say nothing. Addis' throat tightened. Nothing, she lied. She sat at the table, trying to shake the lingering unease, but as she reached for a cup, her mother's eyes widened. Addis. What happened to your hand? Addis looked down and nearly screamed. Her fingers were stained black. Not with dirt, but something deeper, something embedded in her skin, dark veins running up her wrist like spreading roots. She shoved her hand under the table, forcing a laugh. It's nothing. Just ink. Her mother didn't look convinced, but she said no more. Addis barely ate. The whole time, she could feel something watching her. And when she left the kitchen, the voice returned, whispering from the corners of her mind. You cannot escape me. Addis spent the rest of the day trying to ignore the black veins on her hand. She scrubbed them raw, but they wouldn't fade. The more she looked at them, the more they seemed to pulse, like something was alive beneath her skin. By evening, she felt a deep exhaustion weighing her down, but sleep was the last thing she wanted. What if it came back? As night fell, she locked her windows and doors, wrapping herself tightly in her blanket. The village outside was silent, save for the occasional distant sound of crickets. But then, at exactly midnight, the knocking returned. Knock. Knock. Addis squeezed her eyes shut, willing it to go away. Knock. Knock. It was louder this time. And closer. Then, her locked window slid open on its own. A frigid wind rushed in, and her blanket was ripped off her body. Addis sat up in horror as a shadow stood at the foot of her bed. It wasn't just a figure this time. It had form. A woman, her body draped in tattered robes, her face half decayed, half burned. Addis tried to scream, but her voice failed. The figure reached out a long, clawed hand and placed it on Addis' forehead. Now, you will see. And suddenly, Addis was no longer in her room. She was standing in the middle of the forest. Alone. Except, she wasn't alone. Something ancient was watching her. The forest was unlike anything Addis had ever seen. It stretched endlessly in all directions, filled with twisted trees whose bark pulsed like living flesh. The air smelled of decay, thick and suffocating. She turned in frantic circles. How did she get here? Then, she heard it. A chorus of whispers. Dozens of voices, layered over each other, murmuring in a language she didn't understand. The trees seemed to lean closer, their branches stretching toward her like reaching hands. You should not have disturbed my rest. Addis whipped around. The woman from her nightmare was standing just a few feet away, her hollow eyes locked onto Addis. Who are you? Addis stammered. The woman didn't blink. I am the one whose home you defiled. Her voice echoed, shifting between a whisper and a roar. And now, you will suffer as I suffered. Addis shook her head. I didn't know. The woman stepped forward, her skeletal fingers reaching for Addis. Ignorance does not erase your crime. Suddenly, the ground beneath Addis' feet split open. She screamed as hands, dozens of them, burst from the soil, grabbing at her legs, her arms, her neck. She kicked and struggled, but the hands dragged her down. The last thing she saw before sinking into the darkness was the woman's cold, unforgiving gaze. Then, silence. Addis gasped and jolted awake. She was back in her room. But something was horribly wrong. There was dirt beneath her fingernails. And when she looked at her reflection in the mirror, the woman was standing behind her. Addis stumbled away from the mirror, her breath coming in sharp gasps. The woman was in her room. Not as a shadow. Not as a whisper. But standing there, tangible and real. You cannot wake up from this, the woman said. Addis grabbed a lamp from her bedside table and held it forward, but the object passed right through the woman's body as if she were made of mist. A chilling laugh echoed through the room. Addis turned and ran. She flung open her door and sprinted through the house, her feet barely touching the ground. She didn't stop until she was outside, under the moonlight. But when she looked around, her heart nearly stopped. This wasn't her village anymore. The houses were gone. The streets were swallowed by darkness. She was standing in a graveyard. Rows upon rows of nameless graves stretched before her. And in the middle of them, the dry tree stump. Only now, it wasn't dry anymore. It had grown. Its bark was slick with something dark and wet. Its branches curled unnaturally, stretching toward the sky like skeletal fingers. A voice whispered from behind her. You should not have come here. Addis turned. The woman's face was inches from hers. Then, the world went black. Addis awoke on the cold ground, her body trembling. The air around her was thick with the scent of damp earth and rot. She sat up, her eyes darting around. She was still in the graveyard, but now she was surrounded by graves that had been dug open. Shallow pits filled the landscape, and inside them lay skeletons, some fully decayed, others with bits of flesh still clinging to the bone. The sight made her stomach churn. Then, she noticed something worse. One grave was still open. And it had her name carved into the headstone. Her breath hitched. A grave waits for the one who disturbs the dead. The voice came from behind her. Addis turned and saw the woman, her rotting face expressionless, her hollow eyes locked onto Addis. I didn't mean to, Addis tried to plead, but the woman raised a bony finger. The ground beneath Addis began to shift. The earth sank beneath her feet. Addis screamed as her body was pulled downward, the soil swallowing her inch by inch. She clawed at the ground, kicking and thrashing, but it was no use. Then, just as her face was about to be buried, the world snapped back. She was back in her room. Sweat drenched her body. Her sheets were covered in dirt. Her nails were cracked and caked with mud. She looked at her hands. The dark veins had spread up to her elbows. The curse wasn't just haunting her in dreams anymore. It was becoming a part of her. Addis couldn't stay silent any longer. That morning, she sought out the village elders, her hands hidden beneath long sleeves to conceal the blackened veins. The elders sat in a circle beneath the ancient baobab tree, their faces solemn as she explained everything, the dare, the tree stump, the voices, and the terrifying dreams that felt too real. When she finished, an unsettling silence fell over the gathering. Then, the oldest elder, Neka, spoke. "You have made a grave mistake, child." Addis' throat tightened. "I didn't mean to." Neka shook her head. "The tree you desecrated was not just any tree. It was the binding place of Ohonwani, the woman who should never be disturbed." The name sent shivers down Addis' spine. Ohonwani was once a powerful seer, Neka continued, but she was betrayed by the people she served. They accused her of witchcraft, buried her alive, and planted a tree over her grave to keep her spirit contained. Addis' stomach twisted. "Then I freed her. You broke the seal." Neka's gaze was heavy. "And now she is claiming you." Addis' hands trembled beneath her sleeves. "Is there a way to stop her?" Neka sighed. "There is a ritual. But it must be done before the blackness in your veins reaches your heart. If it does, you will belong to her forever." Addis' heartbeat quickened. The black veins were spreading fast. She had little time left. The elders wasted no time. That night, they led Addis deep into the forest, to an ancient shrine where rituals had been performed for generations. Torches flickered, casting eerie shadows across the trees. A small fire burned at the center of the shrine, and around it, the elders drew symbols in white chalk. Neka stood before Addis, a bowl of red powder in her hands. "This will cleanse you," she said, "but the spirit will not leave willingly. It will fight back." Addis swallowed hard. "What do I have to do?" Neka pointed to the fire. "Step inside the circle and kneel." Addis hesitated, then did as instructed. As soon as her knees touched the ground, a cold wind rushed through the shrine. The fire flickered violently. The air grew heavy. Then, a scream pierced the night. Addis clutched her ears as the voice of Ohonwani echoed all around her. "You dare defy me?" The wind turned into a violent storm, whipping around the shrine, almost extinguishing the fire. The elders held their ground, chanting in unison, their voices rising against the howling wind. Addis' body convulsed. Her arms and legs stiffened as an unbearable coldness spread through her chest. It felt like something inside her was being ripped away. Her vision blurred. Her heartbeat slowed. Then, she saw her. Ohonwani stood beyond the fire, her skeletal fingers outstretched. She was trying to pull Addis' soul from her body. And she was succeeding. Addis' body hovered between two worlds. She could still hear the elders chanting, their voices like distant echoes. But in front of her, Ohonwani stood with her arms open, waiting. "Come, child." Ohonwani's voice was soothing now, almost gentle. "You belong with me." Addis' legs felt weak. The darkness was inviting, comforting in a way she didn't understand. Then, she saw her reflection in Ohonwani's eyes. It wasn't her face. It was a corpse. Her skin withered and decayed. Her eyes sunk into black holes. Her fingers shriveled into bones. Ohonwani was showing her what she would become. Addis gasped, snapping back to reality. She fought against the pull, digging her nails into the earth. "No," she screamed. The elders' chants grew louder. The fire blazed brighter. Neka threw the red powder into the flames, and a burst of light erupted, shaking the shrine. Ohonwani let out a blood-curdling scream. Her form began to dissolve, her body twisting and writhing as she was pulled back into the abyss. Adi's chest tightened. The black veins on her arms began to fade. The heaviness in her bones lifted. Then, a final, piercing wail. And Ohonwani was gone. The wind stopped. The fire dimmed. The night was silent once more. Adis collapsed, gasping for air. She was alive. But she knew this wasn't over yet. Adis awoke in her mother's hut, the warmth of a clay lamp flickering beside her. The air was thick with the scent of burning herbs. For a moment, she thought it had all been a terrible dream, until she saw the elders gathered outside, whispering in hushed tones. She pushed herself up, but a sharp pain shot through her chest. Her limbs felt weak, as if she had been drained of all her strength. Slowly, she rolled up the sleeves of her nightgown. The black veins were gone. But in their place, a symbol had been burned into her skin. A strange, twisting mark, not of this world. Her stomach knotted. The ritual had saved her, but it hadn't erased Ohonwani completely. She had left her mark. The door creaked open, and Neka stepped inside. "How do you feel, child?" Adi swallowed hard. "She's gone, isn't she?" The elder nodded, but her eyes carried an unspoken warning. "Gone, but not forgotten." She pointed at Adi's arm. "She has left a piece of herself with you. That mark is not a wound, it is a bond." Adi's breath quickened. "What does it mean?" Neka hesitated. "It means you have been touched by something beyond the realm of the living. You will see things others cannot. Hear whispers in the wind." Adi's hands trembled. "Will she come back?" Neka placed a firm hand on her shoulder. "Not unless you let her." Adis clenched her fist. She would never let that happen. But deep in her bones, she knew this was only the beginning. Days passed, and the village returned to normal. The tree stump had been burned down, the ashes scattered far beyond the village borders. The elders performed a final cleansing, ensuring that Ohonwani's spirit would never return. But Adis knew better. She could feel it. The change inside her. It started with small things. Shadows moved when they shouldn't. A chill lingered in the air, even under the sun. The whispers at night, they never truly stopped. One evening, as she fetched water from the stream, she caught her reflection in the water's surface. At first, it was normal. But then, her reflection smiled. Adi stepped back, her heart hammering. She hadn't smiled. Then, a voice slithered through the wind. "You cannot run from what you've become." Her blood ran cold. She turned sharply, but there was no one there. The mark on her arm burned. For the first time since the ritual, Adis realized the truth. The elders had saved her life, but they had not erased Ohonwani's presence. The spirit still lived inside her. Adis inhaled deeply, clenching her fist. She had survived death. She had fought off the grasp of the spirit world. But she knew this battle was far from over. Ohonwani had lost this time. But she was waiting. And when the time was right, she would try to claim her again. The curse was never truly broken. Thank you for listening to the end of the story. The moral lesson of this story teaches that disrespecting sacred or forbidden places can have dire consequences. Traditions and warnings, often rooted in history and spiritual wisdom, should not be taken lightly. Reckless actions, even when done in ignorance, can awaken forces beyond human control. Additionally, it highlights the idea that some mistakes leave lasting scars. Even when corrected, their effects may linger. Adi's ordeal serves as a reminder that not all things can be undone, and some burdens must be carried for life. Hello listeners. I'd really appreciate it if, after enjoying this story, you could take a moment to like, share, subscribe and leave a comment. Your support means a lot and helps encourage me to keep sharing more stories. Bye.